When the elderly black woman arrived at the wedding, the bride's family barely acknowledged her, but by the end of the night, they would be begging for her forgiveness. The afternoon sun cast a radiant glow over the opulent Harrington estate, its sprawling gardens a meticulously crafted setting for the highly anticipated wedding of the season. White roses delicately adorned the cobblestone pathways, and crystal chandeliers shimmered, suspended from the branches of ancient oak trees, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. Guests, attired in designer gowns and bespoke suits, mingle with champagne flutes in hand. Their conversations filled with tales of lavish vacations and multi-million-dollar business ventures. At the heart of this grand affair stood the radiant bride, Eleanor van der Linde, and her soon-to-be husband, Julian Devereux. Their love story was a celebrated topic within the upper echelons of society. Eleanor, the daughter of a prominent and influential family, was about to join her life with Julian, a self-made entrepreneur renowned for his remarkable work ethic. However, amidst the beauty and celebration, a less harmonious narrative was quietly unfolding. Seraphina Devereux arrived with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Stepping gracefully from the sleek, dark sedan, she was assisted by Julian. Her silver curls softly framed a face that, despite the passage of time, retained a regal presence. Dressed in a modest yet elegant navy blue dress, she carried herself with poise, her warm, brown eyes gently scanning the gathering crowd. This was a moment she had eagerly awaited, to witness her grandson unite in marriage with the woman he loved. Yet, as she moved through the throng of expensively dressed guests, a painful truth began to emerge. The van der Linde family's acknowledgement of Seraphina was minimal at best. Victoria van der Linde, the bride's mother, stood near the grand entrance, a wine glass in her hand, observing Seraphina with a thinly veiled sneer. Turning to a relative, she whispered, her voice just loud enough to carry, "I suppose some people have difficulty discerning the nuances of formal attire." A few stifled laughs followed, their cruelty finding its mark. Seraphina, though she heard the comment, remained composed. Her life had presented her with far greater challenges. Richard van der Linde, Eleanor's father, offered only a cursory nod in Seraphina's direction, omitting a handshake or any semblance of a warm welcome. In his eyes, she was merely another guest, an afterthought. The rest of the van der Linde clan followed suit, their judgmental glances and subtle shifts in conversation, making it clear that Seraphina was not part of their esteemed circle. Julian's jaw tightened with restrained anger, but Seraphina placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's quite all right, dear," she murmured softly. "Some lessons require time to learn." As the celebration progressed, the subtle slights against Seraphina became more pronounced. When she took a seat at one of the tables, guests subtly moved their chairs away, creating an invisible barrier. Attempts at polite conversation were met with curt, dismissive responses. At one point, as she reached for an hors d'oeuvre from a passing tray, Victoria's barely concealed look of distaste was unmistakable. Julian's heart ached for his grandmother, but he also knew the quiet strength she possessed. She remained unruffled, her composure a testament to her resilience. The Van der Lindes, in their arrogance, were unaware of Seraphina Devereux's true identity. They would soon discover that she was no ordinary woman, and before the night concluded, they would be pleading for her forgiveness. The reception reached its zenith, a dazzling display of affluence and privilege. Guests raised their champagne glasses, their laughter echoing through the expansive gardens. Waiters in pristine white uniforms navigated the crowd, balancing trays of exquisite wines and gourmet delicacies. The van der Linde family moved through the sea of high society figures with an air of self-importance, reveling in their perceived superiority. Yet, beneath the veneer of luxury and celebration, a current of arrogance tainted the atmosphere. Seraphina sat at a table on the periphery of the reception, her presence largely ignored by Eleanor's family. She observed how they lavished attention on other guests. A respected judge, the CEO of a renowned fashion house, a tech magnate who had flown in from overseas specifically for the event. These individuals were met with effusive praise, their jokes met with exaggerated laughter, their every word treated as wisdom. But toward Seraphina, there was only invisibility. Victoria van der Linde, positioned at a nearby table, swirled the deep red wine in her glass before leaning toward a group of relatives. A practiced smile graced her lips, her voice smooth but laced with a hint of disdain. "Julian turned out surprisingly well, considering his background," she remarked, ensuring her voice carried to Serafina's ears. Serafina lifted her gaze from her teacup, offering no response. She had lived a long life, weathering countless instances of thoughtless cruelty. Words such as these held little power to wound her. Julian, standing just a short distance away, stiffened. He turned towards Eleanor, expecting her to offer some kind of rebuke, but she hesitated, biting her lip. It was their wedding day, and she was reluctant to cause a scene. Serafina, sensing his rising anger, placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent plea for patience. Not yet. At another table, Richard Van der Linde sat comfortably, surrounded by his closest associates. A man of influence and power, he had spent his life making decisions that shaped industries. His voice, smooth and authoritative, commanded attention, and his pronouncements were met with laughter regardless of their humor. Now, he entertained his companions with a casual dismissal of certain traditions as outdated. His words, though cloaked in sophistication, carried a clear subtext. Their customs, their traditions, were superior. Julian's fists clenched. His own family had traditions rooted in resilience, strength, and unity. His grandmother, sitting just a few feet away, was a living embodiment of those values. Yet, Richard chose to disregard her presence entirely. Serafina, however, remained composed. She had encountered far worse than this in her lifetime. Disrespect from the narrow-minded was nothing new. Instead of reacting with anger, she chose to respond with grace, offering thoughtful and insightful comments throughout the evening. When a guest spoke of the challenges of managing wealth, Serafina offered a gentle smile. "True wealth," she stated, "lies not in numbers, but in how we treat others." When someone scoffed at the notion of humble beginnings, she simply remarked, "You'd be surprised by the greatness that can emerge from the most unexpected places." The Van der Lindes paid little attention to her words. However, one man, seated alone across the reception, observed everything with keen interest. His eyes were sharp, missing no detail, and his presence commanded quiet respect. His tailored suit, though understated, hinted at considerable wealth, and his demeanor suggested he was far from an ordinary guest. He noted Victoria's disdainful expression toward Serafina, the dismissive tone in Richard's voice, and the way other guests subtly distanced themselves from the elderly black woman at the edge of the gathering. He was far from impressed. Serafina, sensing his gaze, briefly met his eyes and offered a knowing smile. The atmosphere was about to shift dramatically, and soon the Van der Lindes would realize the gravity of their misjudgment. The reception continued, the Van der Lindes secure in their carefully curated social circle, oblivious to the impending change. The soft strains of classical music provided a backdrop to the polite chatter and the gentle clinking of glasses as guests offered toasts to the newlyweds. Then, the event coordinator stepped onto the small stage positioned at the center of the reception area, tapping the microphone to gain attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice resonating through the open-air venue. "It is my distinct honor to introduce a truly remarkable guest this evening, an individual whose contributions to the worlds of business, philanthropy, and social change have left an indelible mark on our nation." A ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. The Van der Lindes straightened in their seats, their pride in their elite social standing piqued. A guest of this stature could only enhance their prestige. The well-dressed gentleman, who had been quietly observing the evening's events, finally rose to his feet. All eyes turned towards him, the air thick with anticipation and hushed whispers. But what transpired next sent a shockwave through the Van der Linde family. Instead of proceeding to the podium, the distinguished man turned on his heel and walked directly toward Serafina Devereux. A hush fell over the crowd as he approached the elderly woman with a warm, genuine smile. Then he bowed his head slightly. "Madame Devereux," he said, his voice filled with deep reverence. "It has been far too long." Gasps rippled through the audience. "Madame Devereux?" The tone of his voice, the gesture of respect. This was no casual acquaintance. This was profound admiration. Serafina, still seated, met his gaze with a knowing smile. "Ah, William," she responded smoothly. "You haven't aged a day." The Van Derlyns froze, comprehension slowly dawning on them. William Devereux. The name finally registered in their minds. Not merely a wealthy businessman, but a billionaire, a titan whose name carried immense weight in global industries. A man who had built empires, funded institutions, and transformed countless lives. And here he was, displaying the utmost deference to the elderly black woman they had dismissed without a second thought. Victoria's wine glass nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. Richard's confident smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. Eleanor, her mouth slightly agape, looked back and forth between Seraphina and William, struggling to grasp the unfolding reality. William gestured to capture the crowd's attention. "Many of you know me as a businessman, a philanthropist," he began, his voice resonating with sincerity. "But I would be nowhere if it weren't for one person, the woman seated right here, Seraphina Devereux." Stunned silence filled the room. He turned to Seraphina and offered a warm nod of acknowledgement. "Madame Devereux is one of the most brilliant minds of our time. Decades ago, she built a business empire from the ground up, shattering every obstacle placed in her path. She has dedicated her life to philanthropy, funding countless scholarships for underprivileged students, ensuring that generations have access to opportunities that were once denied to people like us." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged guilty glances, recalling their dismissive treatment of the elderly woman. Others simply stared in shock, their entire perception of the evening undergoing a radical transformation. William continued, his voice ringing through the stunned audience. "She didn't just accumulate wealth. She built legacies. She mentored leaders, invested in communities, and opened doors for those who were systematically shut out." The weight of his words crashed over the Van der Linde family, a crushing wave of realization. The very woman they had treated as insignificant was a titan in her own right, far wealthier and more influential than any of them could ever aspire to be. Richard Van der Linde swallowed hard. His entire existence built upon the pursuit of wealth, power, and cultivating connections with the right people. Yet, the person he had so arrogantly dismissed was someone far beyond his reach. Victoria, still reeling from the shock, attempted to recover, forcing a brittle smile as she leaned toward Seraphina. "Oh, we had no idea," she began, her voice strained with nervous laughter. Seraphina turned to her, her gaze calm and unwavering. "I know," she replied simply. In that moment, Victoria fully comprehended the magnitude of her own arrogance. Julian, who had maintained his composure throughout the evening, now stood a little taller, his pride for his grandmother radiating from him. As for Eleanor, she was overcome with a profound sense of shame. The night had begun with the Van der Lyndes viewing Seraphina as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. But as the evening drew to a close, the truth became undeniable. It was they who were unworthy of being in hers. The grand estate, once filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, now hummed with hushed whispers. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the gathering, and the Van der Linde family stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of their own hubris. Victoria's face had lost its carefully constructed elegance, her meticulously applied makeup failing to conceal the sheer humiliation washing over her. She clutched her wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she grappled with the enormity of the situation. Richard Van der Linde, a man who prided himself on being the most powerful figure in any room, appeared as if he had been physically struck. His world revolved around cultivating the right connections, moving in the most influential circles. Yet, the person he had dismissed without a second thought was the very individual whose respect truly mattered. The realization was more painful than any public embarrassment. Guests, now acutely aware of the injustice that had occurred, stole discreet glances at Seraphina. Some looked ashamed, others fascinated. A few offering murmured apologies, directed not so much at her, but at themselves for their silent complicity. Julian, who had exercised remarkable restraint throughout the evening out of respect for his grandmother, finally stepped forward. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the heavy silence. "It's ironic, isn't it?" he remarked, his gaze sweeping across Eleanor's parents. You were so preoccupied with status, so obsessed with appearances, and yet you disrespected the most important person in this entire gathering. Victoria and Richard visibly flinched. Julian exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. All night, you treated my grandmother as if she were invisible, as if she didn't measure up, and yet she has accomplished more, built more, given more than most people in this room combined. Eleanor, standing beside him, swallowed hard, the heat of shame rising in her face, a consequence not only of her family's actions, but also of her own inaction. Victoria attempted to salvage the situation, forcing a saccharine tone. "Seraphina, dear," she began, "we had absolutely no idea. You really should have informed us earlier." "We would have." Seraphina raised a single hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "There was nothing to be said," she replied smoothly, her voice calm and unwavering. "A person's true worth isn't determined by their words, but by their actions." Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She had no adequate response. Richard, ever the pragmatist, extended a hand toward Seraphina, his smile strained. "Well, Madame Devereux, it's truly an honor. Perhaps we could discuss." Seraphina simply glanced at his outstretched hand, then, with effortless grace, turned away, effectively dismissing the entire conversation. It was a more profound rebuke than any words could have conveyed. The Van Derlins were accustomed to power, to wealth, to commanding attention in any setting. But on this night, they were confronted with a lesson they could never erase. Status is meaningless when it is built upon arrogance and ignorance. Seraphina, maintaining her composure, did not gloat, demand apologies, or revel in their humiliation. Instead, she simply smiled and returned to her seat, enjoying her dessert as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. This was the fundamental difference between them. True class has no connection to wealth or power. True class is defined by character, a quality the Van Derlins demonstrated a profound lack of on this pivotal night. The music resumed, and the wedding guests slowly returned to their conversations, though a palpable shift lingered in the atmosphere. The Harrington estate remained bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, but the Van der Linde family's illusion of superiority had been shattered. Victoria and Richard sat stiffly at their table, their earlier arrogance replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Their practiced charm, the polite smiles they effortlessly displayed at high society gatherings, had vanished. They stood exposed, not only to their peers, but more significantly to themselves. For the first time in years, they were compelled to engage in honest self-reflection. Had they genuinely structured their lives around the superficial notion that wealth equates to worth? Victoria's gaze drifted toward Seraphina, who sat gracefully at a nearby table, engaged in conversation with a billionaire whose revelation had upended the evening. Seraphina possessed an inner peace, a quiet dignity that no amount of money could ever procure. Richard clenched his jaw, observing his guest gravitate toward Seraphina, eager to speak with her, to shake her hand. The very woman they had dismissed had effortlessly become the focal point of the room. And therein lay the most painful truth of all. Eleanor had spent the evening caught between two conflicting loyalties, her love for Julian and her allegiance to the family who had raised her. But in this moment of stark clarity, her path became clear. She turned to Julian, her eyes filled with remorse. "I am so deeply sorry," she whispered. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have stopped them." Julian studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for her hand, his touch a source of comfort and strength. "This isn't your burden to bear alone, Eleanor. What truly matters is how we move forward from here." She nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "Then I promise you this, Julian. Our marriage will not be built upon the kind of ignorance I witnessed tonight. I will not allow prejudice to define our family." Seraphina, having overheard their exchange, offered Eleanor a knowing and encouraging smile. "That's a commendable beginning, my dear. Change isn't merely about words. It's about actions." Eleanor met her gaze and nodded, her resolve firm. "I will prove it." As the evening drew to a close, the Van Derlins remained on the periphery, no longer the untouchable elite they had once deluded themselves to be. They had been humbled. Whether or not they would change was up to them. But one thing was certain. They would never forget this day. Because respect isn't about wealth or status. It's about how you treat others. And sometimes the person you look down on today might be the one who owns a room tomorrow. The music softened, and the remaining guests began to depart, their conversations now hushed and reflective. Eleanor and Julian stood together, hand in hand, a quiet strength passing between them. Seraphina approached them, her eyes filled with warmth. "The beginning of marriage is a sacred promise," she said gently, her voice carrying a wisdom born of experience. "It is a chance to build something new, something better than what came before." Eleanor squeezed Julian's hand, her gaze meeting Seraphina's with newfound determination. "We understand, Seraphina. We want our life together to be defined by love, respect, and equality." Julian nodded in agreement. "We will honor our families, but we will also forge our own path, guided by the lessons learned tonight." A sense of quiet hope began to fill the space, pushing back the lingering shadows of the earlier discord. William stepped forward, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. There was no malice in his touch, only a firm sense of understanding. "Richard," he said, his voice low but resonant, "tonight was a stark reminder of what truly matters in life. It's not too late to learn from it. It's not too late for your family to grow." Richard looked at William, then at Seraphina, and finally at his daughter. For the first time, a flicker of humility crossed his face, a recognition that perhaps his long-held beliefs had been flawed. "Perhaps," he conceded quietly. Victoria, standing beside him, her usual composure shaken, offered a tentative nod. The road ahead would not be easy, but the possibility of change was there. In the following weeks, Eleanor and Julian embarked on their new life together, their bond strengthened by the challenges they had faced. They made a conscious effort to build a home filled with warmth, respect, and open communication. Seraphina became a cherished presence in their lives, her wisdom and grace guiding them as they navigated the complexities of marriage and family. Slowly, tentatively, the Van Derlens began to evolve. Richard started dedicating more time to community initiatives, using his influence to support causes that promoted equality and opportunity. Victoria, though her transformation was more gradual, made an effort to engage with people from diverse backgrounds, broadening her perspective beyond the confines of her social circle. It wasn't a complete or immediate turnaround. There were still moments of discomfort, remnants of old prejudices that surfaced from time to time. But the key was that they were trying. They were learning, growing, and becoming better versions of themselves. Years passed. Eleanor and Julian's love deepened, their family expanded, and the lessons of their wedding day remained a guiding force. The relationship between the Devereaux and the Van Derlens evolved into one of mutual respect and genuine affection. The grand estate, once a stage for arrogance and division, became a place where different perspectives could be shared, where mistakes of the past were acknowledged, and where a shared commitment to a more inclusive future was celebrated. And it all began with an elderly woman's grace, a billionaire's respect, and a young couple's promise to build a love that triumphed over prejudice.